All right. I think we're up and running. So here's the thing that I'm trying to do. I recorded the video reading through Canto 1, and I was happy with the reading using the Longfellow translation, but when I got to the end, I wasn't sure how long I wanted to make the video, and so I thought I'll just do 5 minutes of notes. And ever since I recorded that video, I've just been sitting here regretting that I didn't go completely nerding out on every line that I possibly could. And so this is going to be the insane breakdown video where maybe I'll do these after the canto where I just kind of talk through all the stuff that I have seen almost line by line, not quite, but almost line by line. And so this might end up being long. Again, I'm justifying this just by saying this is self-indulgence. It's pure, beautiful self-indulgence because I love this book so much. So before I do Canto 2, I'm going to talk through a little bit more of Canto 1. So first thing, midway upon the journey of our life, which, in the Italian, I'm not going to read a lot from the Italian because for one thing I'm very slow in Italian, but nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita. So literally in Italian, in the middle of the way of our life. There's this commonality to it. This whole start of Canto 1 is about him waking up in this dark place, and he's not sure how he's gotten there, but it is his own doing. He might have been in a state of, like a fugue state or something, where he's just wandering through life, not using his rationality, not using his will. But he's in this place where apparently all of us come at a stage that's common to us as well, where we realize that we have brought ourselves to a place of total darkness, as it says in this English translation I have here, who I don't even have the name of, the right way was blurred and lost. The way that Longfellow puts it is for the straightforward pathway has been lost. And realizing the environment that you're in is utterly despicable. I already talked about some of that in the other video, so I'm not going to go into that at the moment, but just that commonality. He's referring to something that all of us can understand at a certain point of our lives. So he then attempts to leave this place, and he looks to the height, and he sees a hill, and it's clothed in the rays of the sun. And he refers to this in the Longfellow translation, which I'm pulling here from Project Gutenberg. Vested already in that planet's rays, which leadeth others right by every road. This is the light unto your path. This is the Word of God. He's conflating this idea of the sun and the divine, which is, of course, a common thing. And even in the Middle Ages, you had, right around the time that Dante is writing this, actually, because he's writing this at the beginning of the 14th century. So about 1300, something to that effect, I think, is in the area of where he did this. You had the theology of light. They start in the Gothic buildings, building much bigger windows. They're allowing light into these churches, which were formerly in the Romanesque architecture, much more dark. The parallel between light and divinity is very strong, purging the darkness, pushing out the darkness. And so he's using this here. Dark wood leaves that, goes up to this hill of light. Very strong parallel. It's reminiscent of that C.S. Lewis quote, which says that I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen. Not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And so there's this light that comes from this planet, this sun, which illuminates the right way for everyone. And so he takes a moment for us to see this. And he does take a moment to look back, though. He sees the hill, and he takes a moment to look back, which is that revisiting of sins that comes with penance. So if I am penitent, not only will I change my ways, but I will look back and take full stock of my behavior, of the things I have done, and I will look back on them as someone who, like as he puts it, nearly drowned washes ashore, and you look back at the waves from which you were saved. And with this you get true penitence. There is a humility in recognizing one's wrongs, and Dante seems to be acknowledging that. also like just the simplicity of the imagery that he's offering here. It's not grandiose. The path towards goodness is just a hill. And he has to climb that hill, even though he struggles in unsteady footing going up it. He attempts to climb that hill. He makes this kind of private, personal investment in morality and pushing himself closer to reconciliation with God. But then as soon as he does, he encounters these animals. And I think I mentioned in the last video that these animals are representing of some kinds of sins. And people theorize a lot about them, like the sins of the leopard, the sins of the lion, the sins of the she-wolf. The sins of the leopard are usually thought to be the ones that are false, and sometimes this is attached to the way that the leopard uses this skin to hide itself. It uses this pelt to hide itself. It's covered with spots. It's a bit flashy, but also it's deceptive. And this is connected with the sins of fraud that Dante will encounter near the bottom of these rings of hell that he's about to encounter. And then there's the sins of rage with the lion, which comes in with its head lifted up. And then, of course, those of the she-wolf, which are the sins of appetite. It's the gluttonous sort of sins that we engage in, which are about just fulfilling our desires. And we're not necessarily weaponizing lies or violence, but we're just indulging ourselves. And so that is a common way that you see these parsed out, and even though that is by no means exclusive, that is something that I think makes a pretty interesting parallel, especially because we get these deliberate references like the she-wolf with all hungerings seemed to be laden in her meagerness. She's weighed down by hunger and by desire. And so many folk, and many folk has cause to live forlorn. So she has caused people to live in this sort of absence of something, this emptiness. And she brought upon me so much heaviness, with the affright that from her aspect came, that I the hope relinquished of the height. There seems to be almost a hint here that Dante, maybe this is the thing that he is weakest towards, is his appetites. And that had he been a different man, it might be a different animal that became the conclusive pull on him. So he might be giving us a little bit something of his own temptations, his own weaknesses in this. And he gets thrust back by this. He tries to move up. And so this parallels, of course, this desire that we have to do good. But then as we attempt to do good, we find ourselves shoved back. We're not capable of doing it of our own power. His desire is right. His direction is right. But he is up against it. And as he comes down from this hill is when he encounters Virgil. And of course, Virgil is the guide, and he provides narratively, from a literary point of view, he provides this companion. He's an expositor of moral truths. He's an expositor of philosophy. And he, as I mentioned in the previous video, is kind of a father figure as well. But I think it goes to show that faith is not something that's enacted in isolation. It's not an act of willpower that you take over yourself in order to conquer vice and to live in virtue. There is, of course, an element of ourself that's crucial to it, but with the entrance of Virgil, we see the taking on of a mentor, the submission to someone who knows more than he does. And frequently, as you go through this, you're going to see a lot of Dante's mistakes throughout the journey being given back to him by Virgil and saying, don't do that again. Or, are you really continuing to do this same thing that you have done? Which I think most of us can relate to, as a dog returns to its vomit, as it says in Scripture. So, fascinating thing about Virgil, though, is Virgil is not a Christian. Virgil is not saved. He's virtuous, but he's a virtuous pagan. And so this gets mentioned a little bit by Dante, who talks about him as being, let me see if I can find the exact line I'm thinking of here. Well, right here he talks about God, which you will not hear God and Christ. You won't hear either of those mentioned in Inferno, period. They'll be alluded to in a roundabout way, but you won't hear them referred to, which is interesting. The emperor who reigns above, in that I was rebellious to his law, wills that through me none come into his city. He governs everywhere, and there he reigns. And then this is the line I was thinking of. And I to him, this is Dante, poet, I thee entreat by the same God whom thou didst never know. So one of the theological questions that you see bandied about all the time is, what is the relationship of those who lived prior to Christ? What is their relationship to God? What is their relationship to Christ? In order to do this story, Dante had to come to some conclusions about these questions, and many of them jive with the general teachings of the Catholic Church, both then and now. But he still is taking a lot of literary license in determining these things. So he kind of comes up with a system that deals with all this and becomes part of the narrative. And again, really, I'm not entirely sure how literally anybody should read Dante. His letters seem to indicate that he wanted a little bit of a literal reading of his work, but a lot of it was parallel. It was theology. He offers up a version of reading it that's similar to how you would read Scripture, where you're reading on multiple levels of meaning. I don't think that he's doing that to elevate himself to the level of Scripture. I think he's just talking about there's several different ways to read this. And one of them is that when we read through these questions of what happens to these pagans who lived before the time of Christ, who were virtuous, but they never knew Christ and never knew salvation, because you don't earn salvation. Salvation is given by grace. And it's our acceptance of grace that is the key element to forgiveness. You know, it is not merited by our virtuous lives that we live. I mean, no one is righteous, no, not one, I think is a verse to go to there. And of course, for all have sinned. So let's watch it as it plays out and think about how these elements reflect on the picture of God that Dante is giving us. Because ultimately the picture of God that runs all the way through the Divine Comedy is one of extraordinary love. And we have to see how Dante is fitting these pieces in to see how he is using this to interpret God's love as perfectly just, and then also perfectly merciful. And so that's an intriguing concept. But anyway, let's go back a little bit and talk about this mentor relationship. Virgil is a poet. Dante views himself as a poet. In his life, he had already had some success as a poet, mostly romantic poetry. The Divine Comedy is kind of a step in a different direction for him. It's something that's much more serious, and he did seem to regard it as his magnum opus. This is his great work. And he was also living in Florence, growing up in Florence, and then finding himself a political refugee. Essentially, he gets exiled from Florence through the political machinations of his opponents. And he was not the only person this happened to. He's just the only one who wrote a world-defining classic work thereafter. But he's adrift, and he's living in Ravenna, which is north and to the east of Florence. It's on the coast. It's on the east coast, right on the Adriatic. And in this period of being adrift, because a Florentine of the 14th century would have attached so much value to their city. Italy was at the time broken up into city-states, and there's a ton of city pride, which is kind of national pride, spread between these, even though they do all view themselves as fundamentally inheritors of the Roman Empire, more or less. They're the descendants of the Roman people, And they carry some pride with that, and they know they're connected with each other, but there are linguistic barriers. Dante is writing in Tuscan Italian, which of course is now the Italian language, but they adopted it because of Dante. There's still individual dialects all over Italy, and so I can read this, and it's kind of archaic Italian in a way, but it is a language that was unique to Florence and just to the surrounding towns and cities right around it. Each sort of region of Italy had its own language, and still does. A lot of people in Italy still speak their dialect in addition to Italian. If you go wandering around Italy, you'll see that. The Venetian language is quite different than the Roman one, etc. I don't speak either, but regular Italian is more than enough to keep me constantly humbled. So they view themselves as kind of the inheritors of this Roman world, but Dante is very much attached to his city, and now being separated from it, he's unhappy, and he's rethinking all of his life. He's probably going through a pretty significant crisis at the time that he's writing this, and he puts a lot of his frustration into it, and also, I think, the story of his redemption, which God brings grace out of bad situations. Out of his political exile comes this tremendous work of faith. And we're seeing some of the fruit of that. But it also explains a little bit that identity of his relationship to Virgil. Virgil was the great poet of the Roman Empire. He is a descendant of the Roman Empire. He is also a poet. There is no one in the world that he would regard more highly and that he would respect more for his intellect, his ability to reason, his philosophy, and for his artistic skill. There's nobody who would respect more. This is the perfect mentor to guide him. And, frequently I have thought about this idea that very few of us are rational. I like to think of myself as rational, but I don't think that I could actually swear to that if it came down to it, because we tend to take our opinions from people we admire. This is why, of course, the greater stature one has in culture, especially popular culture, the more that person can sway people to their way of thinking. We want to believe the same things as those people we admire. When it comes to spirituality, there's a little bit of a burden on us to find a way to admire those who are spiritually pure and to take them as mentors so that they can guide you. It's one of those situations where things go down easier that way. It's kind of like putting yourself in temptation to do good by finding spiritual guidance from good people and then directing your admiration towards them. Now, for Dante, I think this is happening quite easily because this is his most admired person. But I'm not overlooking the principle that's being laid down here too, that simply we need spiritual direction of some kind. We need people wiser than us and older than us to give us direction. Otherwise, we find ourselves like Dante, attempting to climb that hill over and over again and butting up against our own sins and not having the accountability and the wisdom on how to navigate that properly. And so what Virgil is going to do is provide a lesson. And that lesson is taught by doing the opposite of what Dante thinks he should be doing. He thinks you should be climbing the hill. Virgil is going to tell him, by virtue of his wisdom and experience, that actually it's the other way. It's the way you would never dream. You actually have to pass through the Inferno to come out the other side, because in doing so you will learn. You will learn things that you cannot learn on this hillside, even though the divine is up there that way, and it's a way that seems right to a man. But he needs that guidance. I think that's valuable. Let's see what other things we want to pull out from. There's a note here in terms of his paganism, where Virgil says, "Sub Julio I was born, though it was late." So under Julius Caesar I was born, though it was late, and lived in Rome under the good Augustus during the time of false and lying gods. He says Augustus is good. Emperor Augustus is good. But the gods are false and lying. This very interesting notion that Dante has about virtue. And we'll see this play up in different ways about what this means for the virtuous pagans and for their false and lying gods. I mean, just as a hint, you will see somebody who is in the Inferno for blaspheming against Jupiter, who is one of the false and lying gods. So putting the pieces of this puzzle together, you have to look at the pattern overall to kind of get a sense of what sin is in the eyes of Dante and what it does to people. Good Augustus, false and lying gods. It's interesting. Now, it's interesting here that, Virgil asked him the question, why do you keep going back to your annoyance? Why don't you climb the Mount Delectable? Why climbst thou not the Mount Delectable, which is the source and cause of every joy? Virgil knows what the issue is. He knows what his task is going to be. He seems to ask this question so that Dante will think about it, even though it gets kind of passed over. Other than him saying, behold the beast for which I have turned back, do protect me from it. You know, he mentions the sin. But again, Virgil he knew what lesson had to be taught because he knows which way they have to go. See, he says, thee it behooves to take another road, responded he, when he beheld me weeping. It is from this savage place thou wouldst escape, because this beast at which thou criest out suffers not anyone to pass her way, but so doth harass him that she destroys him. He knew. He asked that question for the good of Dante. And he knows that she will be there until the Greyhound comes. I do not know what the Greyhound is. I've yet to see a theory that really seems to establish it. It's a strange one. If anybody knows anything about that, do please let me know. And so he's going to take him where thou shalt hear the desperate lamentations, shalt see the ancient spirits disconsolate, who cry out each one for the second death. So these spirits down there wish to be annihilated from the reality that they have built around themselves, which is kind of the way that he frames the punishments of the Inferno. And thou shalt see those who are contented within the fire, because they hope to come whenever it be to the blessed people. Well, this is reference to Purgatorio, and so we'll get to that later. But there's a difference. There is, in Inferno, there is misery and a desire for annihilation. And then in Purgatorio, there is hope for the rising to the blessed people. So, it's such a rich book. Such a rich poem, I really should say. And as we go through, there's going to be line by line, and these kind of breakdowns at the end. I was hesitant to do it at first because I knew it was going to be there's not going to be a big ending that sort of brings it all together in one story. I'll do the closest thing to that in the first video. But the details here are so fun to think about. And so I'm probably going to add these onto the end so that I can have 20-25 minutes of just thinking through them. Again, partially for my own self-indulgence. I love to think through them. Every time I think through them, I learn something else. As I always tell people, there's the Iliad, there's the Divine Comedy, and there's the Lord of the Rings. And these three things are some of the greatest that's ever been written. And maybe someday I'll do the Iliad or something, but right now I just want to work through these canto by canto and really think about them and really go into detail on them and draw as much devotional content as I possibly can and get myself to the point where I know Dante backwards and forwards. That's the goal.